Tokyo, Japan. November 5, 1941, 9:47 in the morning. General Hideki Tojo sat in the antechamber outside the Imperial Conference room, his posture rigid despite 18 consecutive days with fewer than 4 hours of sleep. The uniform he wore carried no decoration beyond rank insignia. His face, narrow and angular beneath cropped black hair already graying at 57, showed nothing of the calculations running through his mind like an abacus operated at impossible speed. Outside the palace walls, Tokyo moved through its routines. Inside these walls, in the next 2 hours, Japan would commit itself to a path from which there could be no reversal. Tojo had been Prime Minister for 19 days. War Minister for 16 months before that. The man they called Razor, for the sharpness of his decisions, now faced the most consequential choice of his career, and he did not yet know if he believed the choice he was about to recommend. The conference room doors opened at precisely 10 o'clock. Tojo entered with the other ministers and military chiefs, each man taking his assigned position. Emperor Hirohito sat at the head of the long table, silent, his presence transforming what might have been a policy meeting into something closer to religious ceremony. The emperor did not speak at these conferences. He observed. The decisions made here would be presented as if they originated from the collective wisdom of Japan's leadership, but everyone in the room understood that nothing happened without imperial approval. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo spoke first, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had spent the previous 72 hours reviewing every diplomatic cable from Washington. The American position had not changed since summer. Complete withdrawal from China. Recognition of Chiang Kai-shek's government. Effective abandonment of the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. These were the terms Secretary of State Cordell Hull insisted upon before economic sanctions could be lifted. Tojo listened without interruption. He had read the same cables. He had participated in the liaison conferences that preceded this moment. But hearing the foreign minister enumerate American demands in the formal setting of an imperial conference gave them a different weight. These were not negotiating positions. They were requirements for Japan's surrender of everything it had fought to achieve over the previous decade. The oil embargo imposed by the United States in July had given Japan approximately 18 months of fuel reserves for military operations. Every day that passed without a resolution reduced those reserves. The Navy's bunker oil would be exhausted by summer of 1943. After that, Japan's fleet would become decorative iron anchored uselessly in harbors while American industrial capacity produced ships at a rate Japan could never match. Admiral Osami Nagano, Chief of the Naval General Staff, presented the military assessment. If war came, Japan's best chance required striking before American and British forces in the Pacific could be reinforced. December offered optimal weather conditions for the operations planners had developed. January would be possible but less favorable. February would require postponement until the following autumn, by which time Japan's strategic position would have deteriorated significantly. Tojo noted that Nagano did not say Japan would win such a war. The admiral said Japan had a chance if war came soon. There was a difference, and everyone in the room understood it. General Hajime Sugiyama, Chief of the Army General Staff, spoke next. The army had 2 million men committed in China with no prospect of victory against Chiang Kai-shek's forces as long as American aid continued flowing through Burma. Southern operations into the Dutch East Indies and British Malaya could secure the oil and resources Japan needed, but only if the United States Pacific Fleet did not interfere. which meant the fleet had to be neutralized before southern operations began. The logic had a terrible clarity. Japan needed oil. The Dutch East Indies had oil. Seizing the Dutch East Indies would bring war with Britain and the Netherlands. War with Britain would likely bring war with the United States given Roosevelt's, short of war, support for the British. Therefore, if Japan moved south, it should assume American intervention and plan accordingly. Which meant striking the Pacific Fleet preemptively to buy time for consolidation of southern territories. Unless diplomacy succeeded. Unless the Americans agreed to terms Japan could accept. Tojo had spent the previous 19 days since becoming Prime Minister reviewing every aspect of Japan's position. Emperor Hirohito had personally instructed him to reconsider the September 6 Imperial Conference decision with fresh eyes, to determine if war was truly unavoidable. The emperor had used the phrase, "wipe the slate clean." Start over. Find another way. Tojo had tried. He had met with senior statesmen, reviewed intelligence assessments, consulted with ministers and military chiefs. He had considered proposals that ranged from complete withdrawal from China to limited withdrawals paired with guarantees of Japanese interests. He had examined the possibility of a summit between Prime Minister and President, face-to-face negotiations that might break the diplomatic impasse. But every scenario ran into the same obstacles. The Americans insisted on Japan's withdrawal from China as a prerequisite for serious negotiations. The army would never accept complete withdrawal. Officers who had fought and died in China for 4 years would not tolerate their government abandoning those gains. The political consequences within Japan's military-dominated government would be catastrophic. And even if Tojo could somehow convince the army to accept withdrawal from China, would it matter? American statements increasingly suggested that Japan's relationship with Germany and Italy also troubled Washington. Roosevelt's "Arsenal of Democracy" speech had made clear that the United States opposed the Axis powers. Japan's tripartite pact alignment put it on the wrong side of American policy regardless of what happened in China. The oil embargo was not simply about China. It was about Japan's entire geopolitical orientation. Changing one policy would not lift the embargo. America wanted Japan to abandon its position as an emerging great power and return to being a secondary Asian nation dependent on Western approval. Tojo did not believe Japan could accept that. The question was whether Japan could afford not to accept it. The conference proceeded through its agenda. Prime Minister Tojo presented the proposal that represented Japan's final diplomatic effort. 2 plans, labeled A and B. Plan A offered significant Japanese concessions on China in exchange for restoration of trade. Plan B, to be presented only if Plan A failed, proposed a more limited arrangement focused on preventing further deterioration of relations. Both plans had deadlines. The diplomatic effort would continue through the end of November. But preparations for war would proceed simultaneously. Military forces would be positioned. Operational orders would be drafted. Training would intensify. If diplomacy failed by November 30, Japan would initiate hostilities in early December. The proposal contained a terrible elegance. It committed Japan to both paths simultaneously. Maximum diplomatic effort paired with maximum military preparation. Peace if possible, war if necessary. The decision to fight would not be made today. It would be made by American actions over the next 25 days. Except that was not entirely true. The decision to fight if diplomacy failed was being made today. The Imperial Conference was not debating whether to authorize military preparations while diplomacy continued. It was debating whether to approve a policy that made war virtually certain unless America changed positions it had held consistently for months. Tojo knew the Americans would not change. He had read Roosevelt's speeches, studied State Department cables, consulted with diplomats who understood American politics. The United States had committed itself publicly to supporting China and opposing Axis aggression. Roosevelt could not reverse those commitments even if he wanted to, which all intelligence suggested he did not. Which meant the diplomatic deadline was really a countdown to war. The November 30th date was when Japan would officially acknowledge what Tojo already knew. Diplomacy would fail. War would come. The only question was whether Japan would be ready. The Navy had concerns. Admiral Nagano had been frank in private consultations. The combined fleet could achieve initial victories, could secure the southern resource areas, could establish a defensive perimeter. But sustaining a long war against American industrial capacity was impossible. Japan's strategy required achieving sufficient early success that America would negotiate a settlement rather than commit to total war. It was a gamble. Tojo understood that. Japan was betting that American public opinion would not support the costs of a prolonged Pacific War. That Roosevelt would accept a negotiated peace that left Japan in control of its sphere of influence. That Germany's war in Europe would prevent America from concentrating full resources against Japan. These assumptions were not certainties. They were hopes dressed in strategic language. But the alternative was accepting American terms, which meant abandoning China, disrupting the Tripartite Pact, and accepting junior status in an American-dominated Pacific order. Tojo had been a soldier for 36 years. He had studied war, commanded troops, administered military bureaucracies. He believed in discipline, in hierarchy, in the clarity of orders and the necessity of obedience. He had built his career on making decisions quickly and executing them precisely. But this decision carried weight that exceeded anything in his experience. If this Imperial Conference approved the November 5 proposal, Japan would spend the next 25 days preparing for war while diplomats went through motions that both sides knew were futile. Ambassador Nomura in Washington would present proposals. Secretary Hull would respond with variations of previous American positions. Japan would make cosmetic concessions. America would demand substantial changes. The deadline would approach. And when November 30th arrived with no breakthrough, the machinery of war would activate. The decision would appear to be made then, in response to diplomatic failure. But the real decision was happening now, in this room, with Emperor Hirohito observing in silence while his ministers and generals committed Japan to a path that made war nearly inevitable. Tojo glanced at the emperor. Hirohito's expression revealed nothing. The emperor had expressed his desire for peace in private conversations. He had instructed Tojo to reconsider the September decision. He had questioned whether war was truly necessary. But imperial wishes were not the same as imperial commands. The emperor relied on his advisors to make recommendations, and those advisors were now recommending a policy that led to war. Tojo spoke when his turn came. His voice was steady, bureaucratic, presenting the November 5 decision as a logical response to circumstances beyond Japan's control. Japan faced economic strangulation. American embargoes threatened national survival. Diplomatic efforts had achieved nothing. Further concessions would bring neither peace nor honor. Therefore Japan must prepare to secure by force what it could not obtain through negotiation. The cabinet ministers voiced their agreement. The military chiefs confirmed their readiness. The foreign minister acknowledged that while diplomatic efforts would continue, expectations for success were minimal. One by one, the men responsible for Japan's governance committed themselves to the proposal. Emperor Hirohito did not speak. His silence was interpreted as consent. The November 5 Imperial Conference decision was approved. The meeting concluded at 12:17 in the afternoon. Tojo walked from the palace into sunlight that seemed too bright after the formal darkness of the conference room. Tokyo continued its routines around him. Citizens moved through streets, conducted business, lived lives that would be transformed by what had just occurred without them knowing it. Tojo returned to the Prime Minister's residence and immediately convened his cabinet ministers. The approval had been given. Now came implementation. The Foreign Ministry would prepare detailed instructions for Ambassador Nomura. The military ministries would accelerate operational preparations. Intelligence services would intensify their monitoring of American activities. Everything would proceed on two parallel tracks: diplomatic negotiations that might succeed but probably would not, and military preparations for war that would begin in early December. The following days blurred into continuous meetings. Tojo slept in intervals measured in minutes, woke to review cables and intelligence reports, made decisions about resource allocations and operational priorities. The machinery of government consumed every hour. But beneath the bureaucratic processes, a single reality dominated everything. Japan had 25 days to achieve through diplomacy what it had failed to achieve in 6 months of negotiations. And if those 25 days produced nothing, Japan would go to war against the most powerful industrial nation on earth with oil reserves sufficient for 18 months of operations and a navy that privately expressed doubts about achieving decisive victory. Tojo did not know if Japan would win such a war. He knew only that failing to fight meant accepting American terms that would destroy everything Japan had tried to build. The choice was between a certain defeat through surrender and a possible defeat through combat. For a military man raised in the samurai tradition, that was not really a choice. On November 7, the combined fleet received its operational orders. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding Japan's naval forces, had developed a plan to strike the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The plan was audacious, risky, and represented Japan's best chance to neutralize American naval power before southern operations began. Yamamoto himself harbored doubts about the long-term prospects for victory, but he had committed to executing the operation if ordered. Tojo did not know the specific details of the Pearl Harbor plan. Naval operations were the Navy's responsibility. Tojo knew there would be an attack on American forces when war began. He knew it would be designed to achieve maximum surprise and inflict maximum damage. But the tactical details remained within Navy channels. What Tojo did know was that once those orders went out, the momentum toward war became almost unstoppable. Ships would move into position. Aircraft would be prepared. Troops would be loaded onto transports. The entire mechanism of Japan's war machine would activate and begin moving toward targets that included American, British, and Dutch forces across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Stopping that machinery would require not just a diplomatic breakthrough but a complete reversal of American policy. And American policy showed no signs of reversal. On November 20, Ambassador Nomura presented Plan B to Secretary Hull. It was Japan's final proposal. A modus vivendi that would freeze the situation in Southeast Asia, restore limited trade, and postpone resolution of the China question for future negotiations. It was not what Japan wanted. It was what Japan could offer while maintaining minimal domestic political viability. Secretary Hull received the proposal and promised to consider it. Then, on November 26, Hull delivered the American response. It was not a counterproposal. It was a restatement of fundamental American demands. Complete withdrawal from China and Indochina, recognition of Chiang Kai-shek's government, effective renunciation of the Tripartite Pact. Tojo received the translated text of Hull's note on the morning of November 27, Tokyo time. He read it twice, checking the translation against the original English to ensure no nuance had been lost. There was no nuance to lose. The American position had not changed. Japan's final diplomatic effort had achieved nothing. A liaison conference convened that afternoon. Foreign Minister Tojo characterized the whole note as an ultimatum, terms America knew Japan could not accept. The consensus in the room was that diplomacy had failed. The November 30 deadline remained, but it had become a formality. The question was no longer whether war would come but when it would begin. Togo raised the possibility of requesting more time, extending negotiations into December to explore whether some modification of American terms might be possible. Tojo rejected the suggestion. More time would only weaken Japan's position. Oil reserves would decrease. American forces in the Philippines and throughout the Pacific would strengthen. Weather conditions for southern operations would deteriorate. Every day of delay reduced Japan's already limited prospects for success. The final Imperial Conference was scheduled for December 1. It would formalize what had effectively been decided on November 5 and confirmed by American intransigence on November 26. Japan would go to war. The date would be early December, specific timing to be determined by operational requirements. The target would include American, British, and Dutch forces. The objective would be to secure the southern resource areas and establish a defensive perimeter that would make reconquest too costly for America to attempt. Tojo spent the evening of November 27 in his office, reviewing operational summaries and intelligence estimates. The papers documented Japanese military strength, American force dispositions, British vulnerabilities in Malaya, Dutch weaknesses in the East Indies. They outlined attack plans, supply requirements, expected casualties, projected timelines for securing objectives. Nowhere in those papers did Tojo find confidence about long-term victory. The plans assumed initial success. They projected that Japan could achieve its territorial objectives within 6 months. But sustaining control against American counterattacks was presented as problematic. American industrial capacity would produce ships, aircraft, and weapons at rates Japan could not match. The perimeter Japan established through early victories would come under increasing pressure as American forces rebuilt and counterattacked. Japan's strategy required that America accept a negotiated settlement rather than fight for total victory. It required that American public opinion, shocked by early defeats and facing the prospect of a long costly war, would pressure Roosevelt to make peace on terms favorable to Japan. Tojo did not know if that would happen. The intelligence estimates suggested it might. American isolationist sentiment remained strong. Roosevelt's critics opposed deeper involvement in foreign wars. Early Japanese victories might convince Americans that the cost of defeating Japan exceeded the value of victory. But those were assumptions built on hope rather than evidence. Tojo had studied enough military history to know that wars rarely developed as planners expected. Surprises occurred. Assumptions proved wrong. Strategies that seemed sound in November might collapse by February when tested against reality. Yet the alternative remained unacceptable. American terms demanded that Japan surrender its position as a great power and accept subordination to Western interests. For a nation that had spent 50 years modernizing and expanding to achieve equality with European powers, that was national humiliation beyond contemplation. Tojo understood the irony. Japan had begun modernization in the 1860s specifically to avoid the fate of China, subjugation by Western powers. Now, pursuing that modernization to its logical conclusion had put Japan at war with the greatest Western power. The effort to achieve independence and equality had led to a conflict that might destroy everything Japan had built. But there was no turning back. The November 5 decision had set events in motion. The Hull Note had confirmed that diplomacy could not resolve the crisis. The December 1 Imperial Conference would formalize what was already inevitable. On the evening of November 30, Tojo met privately with Emperor Hirohito. The meeting was brief, conducted with the formal protocols that governed all interactions between Prime Minister and Emperor. Tojo reported that diplomatic efforts had failed. American terms remained unacceptable. The Imperial Conference scheduled for the following day would consider the final decision on war. The Emperor listened without comment. He asked about the Navy's assessment of prospects for success. Tojo responded that the Navy believed initial operations would succeed but expressed concerns about sustaining a long war against American industrial capacity. The Emperor asked whether there were alternatives to war. Tojo responded that accepting American terms would require abandoning China and accepting national humiliation. The Emperor nodded slowly. He did not express approval of war. He did not issue commands. He simply acknowledged the information Tojo provided and indicated that the Imperial Conference should proceed as scheduled. Tojo left the meeting understanding that the Emperor had accepted the necessity of what was about to happen. It was not enthusiasm. It was resignation. The Emperor recognized that Japan's leadership had committed itself to a path that left no alternative. War was not what anyone wanted. It was what circumstances demanded. December 1, 1941. The final Imperial Conference convened at 10 o'clock in the morning. The agenda was simple: approve the commencement of hostilities against the United States, British Empire, and Netherlands in early December. The discussion followed established protocols. Ministers presented summaries of their department's preparations. Military chiefs confirmed operational readiness. The foreign minister reported that all diplomatic options had been exhausted. The decision required for war had been reached not through desire but through necessity. Emperor Hirohito, as in all previous conferences, did not speak. His presence sanctified the decision. His silence gave consent. At 11:30, the conference concluded with approval of war. Tojo returned to his office and immediately began the final phase of preparations. Coded messages went to military commands throughout Japan and its occupied territories. Final operational orders were issued. The date for commencement of hostilities was set, December 8, Japan time, which would be December 7 across the international date line in Hawaii. Tojo did not know the specific details of the Pearl Harbor attack. That remained a closely held naval secret. He knew that American forces would be struck simultaneously with operations against British and Dutch territories. He knew that the attacks were designed to achieve maximum surprise and inflict maximum damage. He knew that Japan was betting its future on the success of operations planned over the previous months. What Tojo did not know, could not know, was whether Japan would win. The planning assumed success. The intelligence suggested American vulnerabilities. The operational timetables projected rapid conquest of target territories. But assumptions were not certainties. Japan was initiating a war against a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, betting that early victories would convince that nation to accept negotiated peace rather than fight for total victory. It was the greatest gamble in Japan's modern history. And Hideki Tojo, the man called Razor for his decisive mind, had recommended it not because he was certain of victory but because he saw no alternative that preserved Japan's honor and independence. On December 7, 1941, at 7:48 in the morning Hawaiian time, Japanese aircraft struck the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The surprise was complete. The damage was devastating. 8 battleships were sunk or damaged. Thousands of Americans died. The Pacific Fleet's capacity for immediate offensive operations was eliminated. Within hours, Japanese forces struck throughout the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, the Dutch East Indies. Japan's southern expansion began with the speed and violence the operational plans had projected. But Pearl Harbor had made one miscalculation that would prove fatal. The attack sank battleships but missed the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea and survived. And the attack, intended to shock America into accepting a negotiated peace, instead unified American public opinion behind total war. Roosevelt's declaration of war passed Congress with only one dissenting vote. The isolationist movement collapsed overnight. America committed itself not to negotiation but to Japan's unconditional defeat. Tojo would not learn the full implications of that miscalculation for months. In December 1941, he saw only the successful execution of carefully planned operations. Japan's forces were advancing. Territories were being secured. The southern resource areas were falling under Japanese control. The gamble appeared to be succeeding. It would take time for the reality to become clear. Time for American industrial capacity to mobilize. Time for new ships to replace those sunk at Pearl Harbor. Time for the carriers that survived Pearl Harbor to demonstrate that the future of naval warfare belonged to aircraft rather than battleships. Time for Japan's limited resources to strain under the demands of occupying and defending an expanded empire while fighting an enemy with effectively unlimited capacity to produce weapons. The November 5 Imperial Conference had committed Japan to war if diplomacy failed. The December 1 Imperial Conference had confirmed that commitment when diplomacy did fail. Hideki Tojo had recommended both decisions, executed both policies, and set in motion the events that would ultimately destroy everything he had tried to preserve. But in early December 1941, standing in the Prime Minister's office and receiving reports of Japanese victories across the Pacific, Tojo believed he had made the only choice Japan could make. He had chosen war over surrender, combat over humiliation, the uncertain possibility of victory over the certain consequences of defeat. He would later learn that the choice had been between certain defeat through surrender and certain defeat through combat. But the certainty of that outcome would take 4 years of war to confirm. In December 1941, there was only the decision and its execution. The commitment to a path from which there could be no return. The November 5 Imperial Conference of 1941 represented the point of no return in Japan's path to war with the United States. While presented as a continuation of diplomatic efforts paired with military preparation, the decision effectively committed Japan to war unless America completely reversed positions it had held for months. When Secretary of State Hull's November 26 note confirmed that America would not change its demands for Japanese withdrawal from China, the path to war became inevitable. Hideki Tojo's role in these decisions was complex. Appointed Prime Minister specifically to reconsider the September 6 decision for war, Tojo initially attempted to find diplomatic alternatives. But constrained by military realities, domestic political pressures, and American intransigence, he concluded that accepting American terms would destroy Japan's position as a great power. The choice, as he understood it, was between national humiliation through surrender or uncertain prospects through combat. The Pearl Harbor attack achieved tactical surprise but strategic miscalculation. Japan's leadership assumed that early victories would convince America to negotiate a settlement favorable to Japanese interests. Instead, the attack unified American public opinion behind total war. Japan's limited industrial capacity proved incapable of sustaining the long conflict that followed. By July 1944, with American forces advancing through the Pacific, Tojo was forced to resign as Prime Minister. After Japan's surrender in 1945, he was arrested, tried for war crimes, and executed in December 1948. The decisions made in November and December 1941 demonstrated how rational actors, operating within their understanding of national interest, could commit to catastrophically destructive courses of action. Tojo was not insane. He was not seeking destruction. He was attempting to preserve Japan's independence and position in a world where he believed American economic pressure threatened national survival. But the choice to resolve that crisis through war initiated a conflict that killed millions and ended with Japan's unconditional surrender and occupation. If this story gave you insight into one of history's most consequential decisions, please consider subscribing. We explore the moments when individuals faced impossible choices, when the path forward seemed clear but led to outcomes no one anticipated. These are not stories of heroes and villains but of human beings making decisions that shaped our world.